Okay.
There you go. Now you're live.
Welcome, everybody. We're back to personhood in Jewish life and Jewish law. And I'm Rabbi Jonathan Seidel. This is my colleague, Rabbi Phil Bressler.
Good to be back.
And Rochim HaNimtzaim, blessed be those who
Continue to be
come and are here. And we're delighted to have a dialogue tonight about human nature. What is human nature in Jewish philosophy and law as it applies to law, as it applies to decision making? Last time we talked about autonomy and what it means to take on an autonomous halachic system as opposed to a heteronymous, to review. Autonomy means when you choose to accept a legal system of choice, and heteronomy when it's externally imposed by an outside external commander or deity. So, welcome. So last time we talked about where our course focuses on what is a person, what is choice, is there free will, what is the nature of personhood, and what is the nature of choice. And tonight we turn to what is the nature of the human, which is a big question in philosophy across the board in China and India and early Christian thought. Around the world, people consider what is human nature? What is intrinsic to the human being in terms of character, in terms of volition, in terms of the nature of the heart or the soul? There are many, many philosophical questions that this catalyzes. That is, what is actually intrinsic to humans? And we could, of course, go back to our study of primates, primatology, and say what's intrinsic to a chimp? What's intrinsic to the, quote, higher apes that distinguishes them from us? Is always a corollary question. How are we distinguished as our ancestors also from the bestial, from the behemoth, from the nephesh energies of animals? What is intrinsic to the human? This is an entire classes are taught on human nature. And then, of course, we can dissect and take apart the word nature tonight as well, if you'd like, because deconstructing nature is important too for us. So I'm delighted to welcome my colleague to bring source. Tonight we'll have sources and text and discussion. We want to make sure, Rachel, welcome. And I was just introducing this very loaded, and this course can be an entire 8-week course, just what is human nature. It cuts across psychology, anthropology, philosophy, and it's something that we're going to love to hear your thoughts on this. Those of you that are educators, you see the development of human nature with kids. So maybe Rabbi Phil, you start with some text. I was
thinking that too, based on what I was looking at.
And I've got a source sheet, which I'll have to share. And I have material that's not on the source sheet from Qumran, from the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's very important for the pre-rabbinic material between the Bible and the rabbinic literature tonight that I want to talk about. Qumran, the Dead Sea Scroll material. Awesome. Very important. So
good. I'll lay the groundwork then.
Okay.
You'll take us to the upper levels from there. Okay. So does everyone have this right says sources for class 3?
Yeah.
If you're following online, you can find the link in the
Is there another one?
description there. Do we need one more?
I can
Oh,
hear
share. Okay. I will make even more next time. We got a good turnout tonight. Okay, so as Rabbi Jonathan said, we talked last time about what makes us persons, capital P persons. That actually, I guess two sessions ago now. First thing we talked about one thing that makes us essentially persons is our neshama, our capacity for reason and the reflective structure of human consciousness. But the neshama is understood as there are 3 different words for soul: neshama, nefesh, and ruach, that are sort of given a technical sense. Neshama is understood to be a sort of super added soul on top of our nefesh chaya, like our animal soul. We went back to the creation narrative, and God creates all the land dwelling animals with this nefesh chaya, this sort of animal soul. And classical Jewish thought understands humans as being both that sort of animal soul. I'm just going to continue calling that before getting any more specific. But having, in addition, this neshama, that is understood as our capacity for reason. We derive from our animal souls our desire, sort of basic animal desires for food, for sex, possibly mediated between the two in some fashion by our ruach. It maps very neatly onto Freud's id-ego, superego schema. But Judaism is a religion of mitzvot, in other words, divinely ordained commandments. So,
Would you say that again, please?
Yeah, Judaism's a religion of mitzvot, like mitzvah, like literally commandments, divinely ordained commandments, which, within a Jewish framework define what's right and wrong. Doing them right, violating or not, potentially not doing them is understood to be wrong within a Jewish framework. We talked about how in order for that framework to operate, humans need some degree of autonomy, the ability to choose, right or wrong. We discussed a really great midrash 2 weeks ago now, where one of the rabbis, imagines that the whole mountain of Sinai was held over the heads of the Israelite people, and God told them, you can either accept the law or this will be your grave. In other words, I'll drop Mount Sinai on you, which presents a big problem because if that's not really a choice, that's not, and if the law was not really accepted, by making a true choice, then that undermines our obligation to it as descendants of those Israelites. They end up working their way out of that jam, but that choice is essential. And we also talked a little bit about how the possibility of absolute autonomy, like the idea that we make all our own decisions, is really undermined by simultaneous belief in God's absolute power from a rabbinic perspective. That's not necessarily the theology of every person here. We're talking about the classical rabbinic sources. In other words, God made us like this, having animal desires for food and sex and all that kind of thing. But not necessarily, God didn't make us in such a way that we always choose to do the right thing. God deliberately gave us some manner of choice, but also made us subject to other forces. The sort of resolution the rabbis come to is hakol tzafui v'harshut netunah. Everything is foreseen. God still has absolute control over everything, but freedom of choice is given. In other words, God might make you the way you are, but that's as far as God goes in manipulating what you choose to do or not do, at least with regard to the mitzvot. Okay. So this brings us to the question of human nature. So, if we have this choice, why do some people choose to do right and some people don't? Is there maybe something intrinsic in us? So it's often framed as, are humans essentially good or essentially bad? You've probably heard some formulation of that question before, right? And in my opinion, I think that's not an especially Jewish framing of the question. And I'll back that. Why? I think, so there's that tug of war between neshama and nefesh. That gets distilled into this idea of two impulses, that we have impulses in two directions. A yetzer, an impulse or an inclination, yetzer hatov, the good impulse, and the yetzer hara, the evil, wicked, negative, bad, Ra can mean any of those things, the bad impulse. So it's understandable that there would be some discomfort around this idea. If God gave us the nefesh and the neshama, and we understand those as good and evil, then we have within us both good and evil. God, as I said,
you're not saying the nefesh is evil.
No, but not necessarily, not in the nefesh neshama framework, but in the yetzer hatov, yetzer hara, like that sort of pull in two directions. That's how that kind of pull gets understood. Not necessarily evil. I'll get to that. So to understand that there should be some discomfort with this idea that God created people with the capacity to be both good and evil. And my go-to example for an illustration of that discomfort, which you may have experienced already but didn't necessarily know you were experiencing, comes up in the Siddur. So check out source number 1 on my sources for class number 3 page. As someone who would say they are moderately familiar with, actually, Rachel, you're perfect.
Okay.
You're familiar enough with the morning liturgy for Shachrit. This strike you as familiar. This is from Yotzer Or,
Yes.
right? Okay. Can you read that out loud in English? Or?
In English.
Yeah.
Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who forms light and creates darkness, who makes peace and creates all things.
Okay, and what are the words translated there as peace and all things?
Well, shalom is peace,
Mhm.
and et hakol,
Good.
everything. all
Okay.
things.
Okay, so this is from the first blessing before Shema in the morning service. Blessing God for God's role in the whole scheme of creation. God formed light and darkness. God makes peace, shalom, which is understood to be positive, and hakol, everything, right? Now, the liturgy makes liberal use of bits of Tanakh, bits of Bible, and this is actually an allusion to a verse from Isaiah. Can you
Right.
read, Rachel, that verse, source number 2 there, what it's alluding to in Isaiah?
I form light and create darkness. I make weal and create woe. I, the Lord, do all these things.
Okay, so I pulled the translation directly from weal and woe are not words we use all the time, but I think it actually makes more sense in context here. Anyway, so what are the words translated there, Rachel Michelle, as weal and woe?
Well, weal is shalom.
Shalom again, peace or something, again, the positive one.
Woe is ra.
Ra, right? So here shalom is set up as good in opposite, or like in juxtaposition to Ra, bad, right? So here Isaiah is saying, I made light and darkness, two opposite things. I make good and bad things together. I, the Lord, do all those things. What does he do?
Yeah.
When it brings us to us for what we're actually supposed to say every day,
They change.
censors it a little bit.
That's right.
Instead of saying God makes evil, it says God makes everything. We don't ever have to hit that nail squarely on that.
Right. That's problematic.
I mean, maybe, but also I think fairly understandable.
Well, why do you think the rabbis changed it?
I think it's this discomfort with the idea that a good God could create.
Ra.
Yeah,
It's Ra.
yeah. I mean, they're not denying it. They're just skipping over that part for the sake of our morning routine. I
Right.
think, a little bit.
Right.
Okay. So the rabbis differ from Plato, and you'll make sure my understanding of Plato is correct. For whom the rational part of our souls has to constantly struggle against the irrational, more animalistic part. For the rabbis, the yetzer hara, the negative impulse, may be somewhat animal-like, but is nevertheless divinely created. It's not like, if we had our way, if Plato had his way, we might do away completely with the irrational part of our soul, and we would be better off for it. Rabbis aren't necessarily saying that. God created everything. It all has to be there for a purpose. And that's illustrated really plainly by source number 3 there. Eileen, we'll go counterclockwise if you don't mind. Could you read out loud source number 3 there from Bereshit Rabbah? This is a collection of Aggadic Midrash on the Book of Genesis.
Okay, Rabbi Nachman said in Rabbi Samuel's name, "Behold, it was good," refers to the good desire. And behold, it was very good, refers to the evil desire.
So they're referring here, and I think I wrote it in there.
I thought me what?
I understand that reference. Okay. So in other words, it only says, in the creation story, it got, created whatever it was and saw that it was good. It was good, it was good, it was good. But one time it says, and it was very good. And the Midrash here is that Rabbi Nachman says is that one, the very good, that's actually the yetzer hara.
Right.
Okay, keep reading.
Okay.
On the following page.
It only says very good after man was created with both the good and bad inclinations. In all other cases, it only says, and God saw that it was good.
Yeah, that's my explanation. Keep going.
Can then the evil desire be very good? That would be extraordinary. But without the evil desire, however, no man would build a house, take a wife, and beget children, or engage in business.
Yeah. Very famous. Freud knew this text, by the way. And Freud recouched it as id.
Right.
Freud knew Midrash. He didn't admit it. His father trained him in Talmud Torah. So this was construed by Freud as desire, but very base desire, right? Very grounding desire.
But a necessary desire, right? If we didn't have the desire to procreate.
A lot of this stuff you'll see echoed in Freud in his own hierarchy.
Yeah. And in fact, I would argue too, it's a desire that's necessary for us to actually do the positive mitzvot that we're supposed to do. We're positively commanded to pru or vu, to be fruitful and multiply. If we didn't have our Yetzer Hara saying, driving us to do that, we wouldn't be able to possibly fulfill that mitzvah. There are mitzvot that regulate our business dealings.
Right.
And we have to be honest about our business. If we didn't have the desire to make money and profit, we wouldn't be able to do those positive mitzvah.
So you haven't quoted the Bible yet, which is Yetzer Adam Ra v'Ne'urav.
Absolutely.
So the Bible says the inclination or impulse of humans is evil from Ne'urav. Now we can talk about what Ne'urav is for a long time. The age of knowing, adolescence, 6 years. What is Na'ar? What is youth? The inclination of humans is evil from their youth. Not everyone agrees with that, of course, because Freud's going to say we get an id when we're born, right? This desire, just Yetzer. It's not colored by Ra or evil. It's intrinsically just Yetzer.
It's also reflected in the structure of the brain.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So this business of coloring Yetzer with Ra is one part of the Bible, but there's also text where Yetzer is not colored by Ra.
Mm-hmm.
And you have Yetzer. The distinction of the two is what I want to get to in a few minutes.
Oh, good.
And its
Okay.
origins
Good.
in Qumran, in pre-rabbinic thought. I want to talk about that a little, but let's.
Good. Yeah.
Where
so,
are we here? Yeah, you're at Eruvin. So
that actually picks up where you set me up. So what Rabbi Jonathan was alluding to is the pretext for God wiping out humanity, except for Noah, the flood, was seeing how bad everyone was.
Yeah.
Saying, their inclination is towards evil all the time. I'm starting over with you, Noah. So the rabbis actually did consider this question of is that really true? Is our inclination only towards bad all the time? And tried to do the math. So there's a couple of key texts on this one. There's a great debate. Susan, you're up. Could you read source number 4 there from the Babylonian Talmud?
Yeah. The sages taught the following Baraita.
Baraita. That's sort of think of the director's cut version of the Talmud. It's the stuff that got cut out in editing that they bring back here to talk about.
Oh. Yeah. For 2.5 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed. These say it would have been preferable had man not been created than to have been created. And those said it is preferable for man to have been created than had he not been created.
So they've taken both sides of the argument. It
Yeah.
doesn't really matter who's who here. But, okay.
Ultimately, they were counted and concluded.
In other words, they voted. Yeah.
They voted,
Mhm.
okay. It would have been preferable had man not been created than to have been created. However, now that he has been created, he should examine his actions that he has performed and seek to correct them. And some say he should scrutinize his planned actions and evaluate whether or not and in what manner these actions should be performed so that he will not sin.
So the rabbis take a vote, and humanity loses. It would have been better had we not. But we also are dealing with the reality that here we are. In light of that fact, let's take a look at our behavior and examine our actions. And there must be some purpose to that. Yeah, Jeff.
So what's the basis of that statement that it would have been better if humans had not been created?
What do you think?
No, I want to know what the rabbis thought, because I
Well,
don't know.
you've got the movie.
They don't spell it out for us explicitly.
It's implied in the movie Noah by Aronofsky.
Oh, that's true.
The premise of the movie
Because
is
people knew their
if you knew that the subsequent generation of humanity would be as evil as the one that was wiped out, would you allow humanity to have babies and reproduce again? That's the premise, the question of the movie. It's an excellent question, and one is missed by conservatives. If you knew that humanity would be as evil as it was in the Dor HaMabul, the generation wiped out in the flood, the next baby would be just as bad as the others. So the movie, the whole premise of the movie is humanity's going to go bad again. It's going to be filled with Hamas. It's going to be filled with violence and evil and murderers. And so the movie is where the rabbis are. That is, look, even us after the flood, we're just as bad as the people that were wiped out. So why would God allow humanity to continue? The movie says, Noah says, here's the voice, says, no more babies, no more reproduction, right? It's an excellent question.
Yeah.
If you knew that your next child, if no more babies were born after the flood, humanity would end. Okay, I think that's a legitimate question, and that's what they're doing here.
Mm.
Because they're looking post facto, all right, post facto, they're looking at the evil of humanity again. The Romans and the Greeks, and warfare and murderers and torture and evil.
Yeah.
So they're saying better not, right?
They don't spell it out for us exactly what
They-
they're
they're-
doing, but we can
I
imagine.
think that's what they're.
Think of all the violence even in their
They're
era.
in their era.
that we were capable of.
On the other hand, you know, they look at we're here.
Sure.
So what, as you said, what can we do now? And also, do we tell people, you know, not to reproduce? Do you want, you know, every decision not to have a baby is a vote to end humanity in a sense. I see it, although there's millions of people. But we can talk about that. But anybody have any more thoughts on this text? The angels also say, you know, there's another text. The angels say from heaven,
Yes.
don't do it.
So I'm gonna get to one of those. It's not exactly the angel text, but it's a different one. Yeah,
Don't
they
do
have
it,
this.
God.
They have this
Don't
discussion
make
more
humanity.
than
They're,
once
they're evil
in various
intrinsically.
ways. Because they know rabbis, they know righteous people in the world who clearly there's plenty of good created by humanity, and also clearly at the same time there's plenty of bad, and they're trying to figure out which way does the scale tip.
So if God created human beings with to have free will, to make a choice between good and evil actions.
Right. Well, we're going to get to that. I want to step back a little bit. In
It's that's definitely another step forward.
That's,
Yeah.
Good question.
And I think especially illuminating in light of
Excellent question.
Christian ideas about
Yeah.
original
Yeah,
sin.
original
Yeah.
sin, that's what I was gonna
We can
ask.
go there too. If the conversation leads there, we can.
Probably, yeah.
But okay, I have one more text about the rabbis thinking this through. And Phyllis, would you mind reading source number 5 there?
Rabbi
Barachia.
Barachia said, at the moment when God set to create the first human, God saw both righteousness and wicked ones springing from him. God said, if I create them, evildoers will arise from them. But if I don't create them, how will righteous ones arise from them? Side thoughts of human wickedness and relied upon God's attribute of compassion and created them.
Mm-hmm.
So God sort of, here in the Midrash, God is sort of having the same thought process that the rabbis are having. They're tzaddikim, and clearly they're rashayim. They're righteous humans and wicked ones. And, God even has this before going through with the act of creation. And it happens that God resolves to put aside thoughts about human wickedness, focus on the good, and relies on what it calls here midat harachamim, God's attribute of compassion.
Does that mean
It
that
creates
God accepts human wickedness?
What do you think?
I think yes.
I would agree. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what. Yeah, I mean, because the last line is God created. There's no way I think a good God would say, I'm going to deliberately, make the universe worse off.
Is God then responsible for human wickedness?
Well, yeah, okay, so.
You have free will.
Well,
Yeah.
So we've talked about it, but we also have the nefesh chaya. If we're linking that with the impulsive behavior in us, the labeling it of wicked is a interpretive move.
Yeah.
Right.
Is God responsible for creating Hitler?
Well, that's
No serious theology can stand and not address that
That's
question
correct.
these days.
right. We can get to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rabbi Kushner's book is inadequate theology to me. When bad things happen to good people.
So
It's an inadequate book. It's a wonderful book, but it's not adequate theologically.
when bad things happen.
Yeah, the number one bestseller in the
Well,
70s.
it's very simple.
So
Yeah, right.
we'll talk.
So what almost prevents God from creating humanity in the first place is humans' potential for evil, and originating, as we said, in that very power to choose that we're given. So this is why I think are humans essentially good or essentially evil isn't a particularly Jewish framing. We're essentially both. We have within us both the essential quality of good and evil, and what comes out of it is a matter of our choice. So it's just not a particularly operative question. I think it's not the question that most folks most folks ask, or most, I guess the Jewish thinkers tend to ask.
What is the question that they tend to ask?
Well,
This
I think there's a lot, and
conundrum.
we'll go
But, I
into
mean,
them.
is there one?
But
that
I think,
Many.
and this is my own thinking. I can
Uh-huh.
say is that I think dwelling on the question of the sort trying to do the math and
Uh-huh.
thinking that if we can just puzzle this out
Uh,
and decide if we're more good or more bad, that's somehow going to solve our problem.
uh-huh.
Even if we could do that, it isn't going to get us where we want to go.
Okay.
It isn't going to get us where we want to go because we don't have, you can sort of see the results of that kind of logic in Christian theology, where original sin means that, there are many understandings of what original sin actually is, but there's some sort of basic sin to humans somehow, and that leaves us in need of redemption through Christ, right?
Right. Exactly.
That's not operative for Jews. We don't have an essential need to be saved. It's up to individuals to do
Right.
tshuva, which I'm sure you might come back to
But
overnight.
but
that's our solution to the problem. Right. That's why we have
Torah.
That's why we have Yom Kippur. We have the day and all the tools to write ourselves. Right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to say is if the Yetzer Hara are basically our animal desire, called evil, but as we understand, quite essential. What's the counterbalance to that? What is the Yetzer HaTov? Well, it's got to be the human impulse to overcome those desires, right? It's got to be the balance, specifically within a Jewish framework. I think Yeshayahu Leibowitz and others would argue it's the performance of mitzvot. There's a famous commandment that's a great sort of mind bender, especially great to teach. I find to teach kids. Our new friend, would you tell us your name and then
My name is Mitchell.
Mitchell? Hi, welcome. Would you mind reading source number 16 for us?
Yeah, I'll read it. Rabbi Hanina says, greater is one who is commanded to do a mitzvah and performs it than one who is not commanded to do a mitzvah and performs it.
Okay, so let's walk that back and make sure we understand. Greater is one who is commanded
Counterintuitive.
and does, the one
Yeah,
who's
it
not
is.
commanded. Now, if many folks here are parents, would you say you were more proud of your child who cleans their room on their own without being asked? Or the one who, after you told them,
Right.
go clean your room right now, and then goes and does it? Who are you more proud of?
The first.
The first, right? The one who does it without being commanded, right?
Right.
So this is
very
This is exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
So how do we get there? That's really the a big part of what Yeshayahu Leibowitz is about in his his essay on the mitzvot, on the commandments. Here and in many other places, how is it that commandedness is actually better? We don't have to read this whole thing, but the whole thing out loud. But his main point is, man is subject to the natural order. We have these impulses. So that's actually in some ways a form of heteronomy, of not making our own choices,
Right.
because we don't get to choose our animal nature. That's just something that is innately in us. So just obeying our nature is actually the least autonomous choice you could make.
Right.
So therefore, the most autonomous choice you can make is to do something that directly defies that. In other words, embrace a lifestyle, paradoxically, right?
Yes.
Ironically, embrace a lifestyle that is totally unnatural, as it were, that's designed to control and harness those basic desires for good. Same as we just said, we need the basic desire for procreation so that we can do the positive mitzvah of being fruitful and multiply. We need the basic desire for profit so that we can do the mitzvah of doing ethical business. So here he argues there is no freedom from the chains of nature except through accepting the yoke of the Torah and mitzvot, a yoke not imposed by nature.
Mm-hmm.
This is the meaning of the rabbinic saying: the only free person is he who is concerned with Torah. So I'll let you decide what you think of that for yourself and for your own Jewish practice.
Halachocracy, I call it.
Sure,
Leibowitz
absolutely.
is criticized for worshiping halakha, by the way.
Yeah, I would say exactly. He works from a
Places
place,
halakha as in the level of God.
and
That's the
he's not alone in terms of
He's not
thinkers
alone.
who
Is modern Orthodox the philosophy.
He assumes his conclusion. He's modern Orthodox and keeps halakha, therefore
Right.
his practice must be right, therefore he's working
That's right.
towards that goal.
It's a circular
I think that's a fair criticism there. Absolutely.
Circular reasoning.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a fair critique.
I want to go back to
Please keep going.
thank you.
Yeah.
Wonderful sources. I want to go back to antiquity when they wrestled with the intrinsic nature of humanity. Let's go back and talk about nature again. What is this impulse? What is this drive? So before there was Yetzer Ra and Yetzer Tov, there was just Yetzer. It was a drive. And in the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the authors mentioned Yetzer Lev Adam. Lev was considered part of the Yetzer, the heart. It was not distinct. The heart becomes another factor. Before neshama and nefesh are individuated, you have the heart of man. Also mind in the Bible is mind. So mind and heart.
They thought of the heart as
the seed of thought.
They didn't really understand what
So Yetzer Lev Hadam was what the Qumran scrolls talk about. And later on, the rabbis separate Yetzer and Lev, which is very interesting. The impulse and the heart are separated later in the sources. But Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, is that stage between the Bible and the rabbis, before the rabbinic literature is concretized. And the Yetzer is reified, meaning it's set up as like almost an independent force that governs us. That's like Satan is under that table. He's going to grab you. You don't see him, but he's going to grab you. If you give him just an inch, he'll take a mile. Okay, you've heard preachers like that? You just give him a little bit. Okay, you look at that woman for half a second, you'll be gazing at her for 4, you get in trouble. Okay, you do this, you'll be in somebody doing something illegal because you just gave yourself a window of opportunity. So the Yetzer takes over.
So Satan
Slippery
as
slope.
personification of
So
Yetzer.
Satan-
The devil made
Yeah.
me do it.
So the
Personification,
Yetzer,
right,
so you
yeah.
can start to see in rabbinic literature, is the Yetzer as it emerges and reified, is it an independent force that actually takes you over, that God lets you know that you go down that road and it takes you over and has a reified independent force? Because the Yetzer on the sources we're going to look at later has almost an independent, it's like a person. And in some of the rabbinic sources, it's demonic. It has demonic status. It's a demon. It takes you because you let him in. You almost get possessed by your Yetzer. You start letting you let Satan in for 1 minute, it's going to be your whole lifetime. Excuse me. Okay? I'm serious preaching in Christianity about that.
Yeah.
Which comes out of rabbinics, or early rabbinics. Christianity and Judaism are hand in hand here. So once the Yetzer is reified as an independent source, it almost is like it's in the room. It's almost a demonic entity. Now, some of the rabbis rejected that. They said, no, it's an intrinsic impulse. It's an energetic nefesh impulse, the Yetzer Hara, as we've seen here. It makes you do things because it's drive. And men and women have drive. Both manifest differently, gender, but we all have drive. And Freud reifies that in his way with it. And he's basing it on rabbinics, by the way. He knew rabbinics. He knew other philosophy of what's our drive. And you know people with a lot of fierceness and drive, like Sabrina Ionesco. I've never seen a basketball player with that kind of drive. Okay, that's a physical, emotional, intellectual drive I've rarely seen on the basketball court watching the Duck women's basketball.
Oh, okay.
Okay, she's the national star. I've never seen such ferocity because she wants to win. But there are other people, you know what drive is. And you can have drive when you're 90 or 100. So I'm very interested in what's intrinsic energies, nefesh energies, that need to be mastered. So you're in the Middle Ages, they say that human beings have a neshama and an active intellect that's divine to govern the nefesh energies. That we more or less govern them as human beings, some less than others. But chimps and animals work out of their own nefesh animated nature, and they can't govern their animal abilities. They work instinctively, right? And they work out of their nature. Can they be trained to develop a consciousness to control themselves? I think at some level, right, we can talk about that. Dogs, cats, chimps, be trained.
They know when they've done wrong.
They know, they're conscious of wrong or something. Mm-hmm. So the Qumran scrolls, to go back to Qumran, is that stage when before the Yetzer is reified, but by the late rabbinic period, the Yetzer is raw and it's demonic. It's almost like a demonic possession takes you over. you let that Yetzer Hara come in, and it's going to take you over. So that's why the mitzvot then are a hedge against that. They're a barrier. And you must, and Leibowitz is one of many, Maimonides. Maimonides said, doing the mitzvot, not seven ishma, do them first and then think about them. Do them because they're going to prevent your Yetzer Hara from ruling you. Okay? Just like we've all made mistakes with our speech and maybe our energies. But we can govern our speech, our energies, our sexuality through the mitzvot. And that's another reason the rabbi said women should cover up and men should wear tzitzis. Because the tzitzis come and remind you to control your energy, especially your sexuality. We haven't touched on sexuality, but it's right here, okay? That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about energy, talking about our sexual energy, talking about our intrinsic drive. For Freud, that's it. Okay, they're talking about building a house. So how do we channel our sexuality and not let it rule us and ruin us? Yes. How is that possible? And Rabbinic Judaism offers solutions for that are classic. We can talk about that. So I brought a source sheet. There's a lot of text on the Yetzer Hara in rabbinic literature. There must be hundreds of texts. You brought the most famous.
Yeah.
But there are many texts. I passed out a few here. I wanted to go over a few with you from rabbinic literature.
Before you start,
Yeah, go
you
ahead.
used the word reify
Reify.
quite a few times.
To
I'm not familiar with it.
reify is to set up as an independent existence, or to
make real.
make real in a new way. So you might have the word Yetzer in the Bible, 500 BC, 1000 BC. Yetzer Adam Ra Menu'urav. Genesis. The inclination or impulse of humanity is evil from his youth. By the way, not from birth, not St. Augustine. What do the Christians do? Okay?
From the age of reason.
The age of what's youth? I don't know, 7, 8, 9? I really don't know. All of us are.
It was different back then.
It's different. Yeah, for them it might have been younger, like a 3 or 4-year-old knows when they've done wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us are very
There's
children.
definitely, I think it might be in Bereshit Rabbah where they discuss when a person gets there, when a person gets their nefesh and when a person gets their neshama. Is it while you're still in the womb, or is it on your way out?
Yeah,
But
it's
right.
close to the very
it's an
beginning.
educational question with our children and for us.
It's not early on.
This child is so good. They felt, a good child, and so what does it mean? And so there's a debate, so the Christians say, that there's a taintedness in the womb, first that the fall, the rebellion, the fall of just eating the fruit, whatever it might have been, it is an original sin that can only be compensated by the coming of Christ, right, and the death and the resurrection for Paul, and then other views say, so it's in other words, God made us so that we need to be redeemed by the Christ. The medicine was given with the disease, and the disease is original. St. Augustine writes much more extensively about original sin and what that means in terms of Eve's sin being passed on through birth, right? And the Bible doesn't really discuss that. The Tanakh doesn't do that, but the New Testament and Paul implies that, and then Augustine builds that theory, and the rabbis have to deal with it. And the rabbis in the Middle Ages come up with the idea in the Zohar that Eve is given poison in the womb. Every single baby gets poisoned by the Sitra Achra, which is the other side comes into the womb of every person and poisons them with sin. So that's pretty damn close to the St. Augustine. That's in the Zohar. So we all get poisoned. I prefer Niebuhr, Reinhold Niebuhr, the great Protestant philosopher, and Heschel were very close. They said we incline to sin. In other words, we all sin. We all sin. It doesn't mean are we intrinsically sinners? Is a different question. So Niebuhr and Heschel, Rosenzweig, many modern philosophers, we incline. All of us make mistakes. Some egregious, some others, but we all sin at some level. Does that mean we're intrinsically sinners? And I think that's an important question for Judaism. I don't like the word sin, but I think Jews need to talk about that. I've had heavy debates with people over the last 40, 50 years. We intrinsically sin. We all sin. So does the Yetzer Hara exist in all of us that we all will sin more or less? We're not all Hitler, Lahavdil. Okay, we're not Hitler, but we're somewhere between perfect and Hitler. I mean,
We're missing the mark.
you know,
We're missing the mark. Like
yeah, we missed the
yeah.
mark. So we missed the mark willfully. We missed the mark non-volitionally. You know, that's where tshuva comes in. Tshuva is again the solution to what we've been made. So I think there's some good questions here for us to consider. I do not have answers on this. I'm just like you. I've just been thinking about this since I've been 3. But like you, I considered these questions. I had a rabbi that helped me ask the right questions when I was a teenager about these issues. May he live and be well. My Reformed temple and left open my Kroloff. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this human nature issue. New?
New.
Please pipe in, or please, Rabbi.
I mean, so did you pull every Yetzer text from Svaria?
There's a lot.
There's really a lot.
There's-
I mean, the thickness of this packet
Yeah, and then the
gives
Yetzer,
you a sense of
like the Yetzer
how
Hara
much time and
is
effort they
often
put
in
into
the room.
this.
And you know, it's
Wow.
almost
Many of these are.
yeah. You could
Chovot HaLevavot.
yeah no that's
who wrote
later.
that one?
Chovot Levavot is Bachya ibn Pakuda.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, so so there are some medieval versions. in
Okay,
here,
so a lot of them are.
There are some middle. So the Yetzer not satisfied with one battle, 100 has defeated you or defeated him. So it's a constant. Then in the Middle Age, it's all about a battle with the Yetzer Hara.
My favorite is the first
battling your negative energies. You're always in battle, just like the jihadi is supposed to have an internal struggle, a battle against his pride, ego, sinfulness, arrogance. That's what jihad means. The internal jihad.
Mm-hmm.
Also the external jihad. But the internal jihad is just like this. We are constantly battling your Yetzer Hara. And you could also argue that the repression of sexuality in the rabbinic world leads precisely to more challenges. That is, if you're a hedonist, you're not challenged in the same way. If you constantly are repressing your sexuality. So the 60s saw an opening of energies where people rejected this particular ideology. And they said, no, indulge your desires. You know, the 70s were wild. I can testify. Okay, firsthand. And you get rid of the just repression of sexuality almost leads to a reification or a personification of your sexuality. So St. Anthony goes off to a cave. He escapes women and song and wealth. Right? St. Anthony, remember that story? This paper. So St. Anthony was a great wealthy Christian who was he was indulgent with women and sex and wine and parties. He said, I'm getting rid of all of it. I'm going to be an anchorite in the wilderness. And he goes off to a cave. And who follows him to the cave? At night, what is he dreaming of all night? It's a famous sex, parties, drinking, sex. So he can't get away from it. So he's plagued by the very thing that he left and repressed. Whereas, you know, there's some balance between indulging all that and then fleeing off to the desert. And the rabbis have the same stories. I bring that story up because practically the same stories in rabbinic literature. The rabbi that flees and he goes across the ocean. And there's a prostitute, right? And he meets a prostitute and he's good. He doesn't indulge and have sex with the prostitute. Instead, his tzitzis comes up and slaps him in the face as he's about to have sex with the prostitute. Okay, and then she sees him conquer his sexuality at the moment, and she converts to Judaism because he's so good. There are all these folk tales about admiring the courageous rabbi who conquers his Yetzer when he could have had sex. And she goes, why don't you sleep with me? But he goes, no, I have to conquer my inclination. So the tzitzis comes up and talks to him and slaps him. So
that's what it's for, right? That's why you have it, is to remind you to behave, to do good things.
That's right. It's a reminder. It's right.
So, I mean, what I'm thinking about is if the mitzvot are good, if that's how we understand, like doing good is doing mitzvot, does that necessarily mean that the opposite of doing mitzvot is necessarily bad? Like, is that where we get our sense that sort of unrestrained sexual desire, unrestrained lust is not just animal sort of neutral, but maybe base is a good word. Not just base, but actually evil. Is it the sort of necessary flip side of understanding the mitzvot that we do as the positive direction to go? Does that sort of create the negative direction?
Good question. That's very good. So
That's what I'm thinking about.
if you don't do mitzvot, you're Russia. You're evil.
Well, I mean, obviously you have to do mitzvot. Judaism would lose coherence without mitzvot.
Well, liberal Judaism defines that differently than Orthodoxy, right?
Right. Yeah.
Well, sure, yeah.
We none of us are Orthodox in this room. We don't take on the whole Old Malchut Shemayim, the entire yoke of the Torah, right?
Right.
All the mitzvahs, right? All that apply to 468 of the 613, whatever. If you don't, and to take on all the mitzvot, if you're Orthodox or even conservative, the conservative movement expects that you take on the entire system of mitzvot.
At least in theory.
In theory.
Yeah, in theory.
In theory, and the conservative movement makes, their leaders, take on the yoke. And Solomon Schechter said, it's a joyous yoke. You take it on with joy. You're a happy slave. Right? So,
or truly free, depending on what.
But I like Leibowitz's point is that the yoking of human nature is a good thing. And where if you go to Esalen, it's the opposite. Okay, Esalen or embodied.
You're too young.
I went Esalen for me.
No.
Yeah, that one I don't know.
Born yesterday, but wiser than all of us.
You don't know Esalen?
No, how do you spell it?
Esalen was a retreat center that was founded in the
California.
70s. Very important, a new age. So my point is that in the 70s, in becoming embodied and not taking on heteronymous systems of mitzvot, of external law, was a healthy way. It was considered the freeing way. So there are very important questions that Leibowitz raises, which is Leibowitz says the mitzvot system yokes us from our nature, which is not good. It's animalistic and it's counterintuitive too. So I've read Leibowitz very seriously, where Rosenzweig doesn't go that far, or even Heschel really, because Leibowitz elevates halakha to almost a deity. He's been criticized for that. So these are some of the questions about human nature. Earth-based Judaism would see certain earth energies and goddess energies as more healthy than patriarchal constructions of law. Can I put it in one sentence, right? Earth-based path would be considered healthier and more natural in a good way than this patriarchal system of law imposed on people who they're really oppressing people through the system of law. Okay, let me take the other side. It's oppressive and it's patriarchal and it's run by men.
Right.
Okay, and that is a problem. At least I see it as a problem.
Absolutely.
I see it as a problem historically and today.
And the rabbis spend a ton of time thinking about how to master their sexual desires and things like that. Like we've seen how that plays out in not just not just Jewish circles, but all over the place.
Priests.
I mean, sure, that's one.
With all the
I'm sure we think of more. Like that's clearly a bad thing.
Yeah.
I mean,
so and you all know atheists, and some of you might be, and half a bit, I don't know.
Yeah, probably.
But atheists who do good in the world do not need an external system of commandments of an external commander.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the term mitzvah then would be more of connection to what is good, and more Plato and Aristotle there.
But they do have an external system. They may say they're
Yes,
not religious,
that's right.
but they're still using Judeo-Christian morality.
That's right. They're still taking on
those morals.
More or less.
Yeah,
That's right.
Absolutely.
More or less, and it's built in.
Yeah.
It's almost learned. So there is some externals. It's not just do what feels good.
Right.
There's some notion. So atheists have a system they've inherited from the larger religious society. That's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
But that comes closer to the Greeks, right? To follow the good, to Plato and Aristotle in Aristotle's Ethics.
Well, for Christians, isn't it that the fear of going to hell is supposed to control your evil impulse? In that,
that's one of the things, right? But it's
so
also
why would you do good if you're not worried about that?
By being unified with the Christ, one is out of that corollary, out of that situation of being unified with the Christ, whether you're in the Eastern Church or the Western, Out of that comes ethical behavior. But the book, the rejection of the halakha in Christianity isn't famous with Paul. But then you have the book of James, which is halakha, which says works are more important than faith. It's the only book in the New Testament. Works, meaning mitzvahs,
Really?
ethical mitzvahs. The only book, including the New Testament, that privileges works over faith. And it was not popular among the Paulines. It's more rabbinic.
Yeah.
Because who is it written by? Jesus' brother. Who is Jesus' brother?
A Jew.
A rabbinic Jew, probably a Pharisee, Yaakov, James.
Yeah.
Think about that. The Jesus family was halachic at some level or another.
Yeah.
Jesus observed the halakha. Jesus' family was an observant group of Jews until they were taken over by the Pauline. So the book of James seems to recognize the importance of doing a system of mitzvot. It's an important book and ignored by many Protestants today. But I encourage people to read the book of James because it says works and faith together make up a religious person. And it sounds very rabbinic to me in the New Testament. And you know what Bernie Sanders thinks is the good is different than what Mike Bloomberg thinks is the good. You know, two septenarian Jews arguing for the political good and personal good of the country. I think that's an interesting question. Where do they get their morality? Neither being halachic, but being very Jewish in their own way. I think that's interesting to me to see how they've evolved a sense of the public good. One more left socialist, one more conservative, more Republican leaning. But I think that's interesting to see how their families taught them ethics. Very strong notions of ethics in those two guys.
Yeah.
Both, you know, there's so many interesting things about people who are not raised religious.
And then you have Steve Miller.
Oh, well. I won't tell you where he's going.
So,
But go ahead. Yeah, please.
so I'm just pondering here. And I need some help in your input. So, in my limited understanding in Christianity, man is separated from his nature because his nature is bad, evil, not good,
Sure.
nasty drives, blah, blah. So, and he's separated from his nature, to go through Christ for salvation.
Right.
That's it.
Simply put,
Yeah.
but that's where he finds his
Good faith.
Right.
salvation.
And you need to express faith in that process.
Exactly.
Right.
You
Exactly.
just say it.
But there's an
Believe it.
external redemptive.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, so reading this, there's no freedom from the chains of nature except through accepting the yoke of the Torah. So the only free person is he who is connected to Torah, who's
Right.
concerned with
Truly
Torah,
free.
who's lived his life, who lives his life in does that mean in the study of Torah?
Well,
Living his life by the laws of Torah. Is that what that means?
Depends who you ask.
What does that mean? I don't
Depends who you
know.
ask. So that line comes from the Mishnah. So that's the late the
third century.
third century,
Early 220 CE.
And so for them, yes, but that's a different understanding of living by the mitzvot than
So-
Leibowitz in the 20th century.
So in a sense then, and I could be probably all wrong, but in a sense, the way this
Yeah.
perhaps is talking, there's not such a gigantic difference between this sense of bad nature, that nature is to trick us, to deceive us, to bring us into evil,
Yeah.
from Judaism to
That's right.
Christianity.
I agree.
Oh, I would disagree.
I think
Because
they're
I
actually
don't
pretty close.
see the way to
Good.
salvation or goodness or
Right.
a repudiation or some kind of legitimacy is through very different channels. I mean, we don't have a Christ figure we go through,
Right.
but we have a Torah figure we go
Well-
through. I'm
Are
sorry.
you,
my
are you asking
language
about the
isn't right.
presupposition of human nature? Or are you
Well,
talking
I'm
about?
talking about the division between man and nature in Christianity and
And then
Judaism.
either way, we need some kind of help or structure or something like that, whether it's Jesus or Torah and mitzvot. That either way, it's sort of
saying the same thing.
So I would say,
No.
I would say
No.
no. But so in both cases, there's an. I mean, I think they frame the nature of the bad impulse differently,
Mhm.
and there are, I believe, many different Christian understandings of what exactly the original
I'm
sin
sure.
is. Everywhere from sort of a small, relatively insignificant taint to,
Right.
overwhelming,
That's right.
sin, completely sinful nature all
That's
the
right.
time.
That's right.
And everywhere in between. So not to try to pigeonhole that, but there is an assumption on the Christian part of it essentially inevitable failure, that it doesn't matter, that it doesn't matter whether you do Torah and mitzvot or what you do. There's only one way to salvation, which is through.
Yeah, and it gets,
So
Whereas
you're
for
bad to
Jews,
begin with. You're bad
which is for Jews,
initially.
there is an
Yeah.
assumption. There is, I would say, also an assumption of inevitable failure. That there are no, there may be, I don't know, the Lamed Vav Nikim, like the tzaddik, the very rare tzaddik who is such a righteous person that they can
Right.
actually do it all.
Right.
But the assumption for most of us is inevitable failure.
Right.
But that doesn't mean we're damned
Which
or
is-
doomed or somehow
No,
bad.
not
It just
at all.
means we're still working at it.
Right. Right.
So,
But
that's where they diverge. Is
yes, and Shua.
is
No, I
so badly
understand
do
that.
right.
Yeah, I was just talking about this.
Mhm.
And I'm sorry, this maybe it's moot,
No.
but this
No.
separation in our nature.
Right.
And
Right.
our separation from nature,
Right.
that I think is very well documented in both religions.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
because nature will do us in.
Right, you're right.
Like, so when you go to Esalen and you sit in those tubs on those cliffs, you're just full in nature, and
Well,
you're being done in.
Well, I would argue that we need more of nature-based Judaism in our
I would-
lives.
Nature-based
and
humanism.
earth-based humans, but not to worship the earth, lest we become like Mussolini and the fascist, you call it the fascist nature worshippers that worship the earth's power as part of might and brutality, which is what we saw with Mussolini and Hitler and the what I call eco-fascism. That's a whole nother interesting conversation. But it's worth it worshiping the earth as power. That's, you'll find in Teutonic religions and other religions, leads to fascism.
Okay.
And so that's a problem. But I do think that's a wonderful hour that we could do
Sure.
on what it means to live an earth-based Jewish life.
And
That's more to our nature, our good nature of the earth.
yeah.
And I think for Valis Jews, clearly in Judaism, we're connected to nature here.
I think so.
And we're kind of, the way we're kind of separated is, I went to a synagogue once in Mexico. And right across the street, there was a farm with a bunch of goats. And in the middle of everyone would be davening, all of a sudden you hear this,
Yeah.
but it was a very tribal feeling.
Sure, like our ancestors.
Yeah.
Davened outside with animals.
Right, and the goats would
Yeah,
be doing their thing.
So I think this has all been, the conversation has changed a lot in light of modern understandings of how brains work. Like,
Oh, yeah.
they were all understanding our reason is separate from our impulse, but we understand now that even our reason is still just neurons firing in our brains, the same as our impulses are just neurons firing in the brains. And so on some level, our reason and our impulse are all the same thing. It's all brain chemistry. So
That's reductionistic.
well, right, but also it's not. Like
It's
our
true.
brains are still natural things. Like
Right.
within a scientific.
Right, Steven
understand?
Steven Pinker, who, Pinker is the great philosopher of the mechanics of the brain today, the psychologist,
Okay. Yeah.
and he's been accused of reductionism. There's no soul, there's no neshama in it. It's a machine.
Where consciousness
Consciousness is
independent of a physiological
That's-
functioning.
Right.
right. He's been accused of
Bio-
believing that. He's Harvard, MIT's professor,
Got
a Jew. Problematic from a theological point of view, his work. I read
Yeah,
a lot
right,
of his
clearly.
books. but it could be construed as reducing us to neurons, and I don't want to be reduced.
Fair enough,
to
me either.
neurons. But it's true that we can talk about how it all works that way.
Yeah,
you're right.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so this, you're talking about the separation between nature, our, however we want to phrase that, our
Right.
Yetzer Tov and our Yetzer Hara, our neshama and our nefesh, our nature and our reason. That's not necessarily as real of a separation as we might have thought.
Right.
There may be some difference, but it may not be as entirely.
Antonio Damasio,
Right.
All his books, this neuropsychologist and physiology professor, MD, teaches at UCLA, Italian American. Recommend all his books. Looking for Spinoza, Damasio, on this very topic: emotions, the firing of the brain, reductionism, the soul. He's written some brilliant works. I like him a lot. Antonio Damasio.
Einstein liked him too. Einstein liked him too.
Yeah, Damasio is he's alive. He's in his 70s. But Antonio Damasio is excellent on these issues, among others, in neuroanatomy. I recommend him highly on what's cognition, what's consciousness, what's our soul. He's trained in medicine, very good guy in neuropsychology and anatomy. This is big stuff here.
Yes,
Yeah, it's been wrestled with for decades, maybe centuries. The mind-brain identity problem.
Sure.
Chomsky, right?
Chomsky, he was philosophy talk at Stanford. Every year they do something on this topic. Or twice a year on mind-brain issues
Is that right?
in philosophy. Yeah, it's great. Great question.
So the good news is we need not solve it tonight. We don't need to move on through what we have planned. The next, I think we have 3 sessions remaining in between now and I hope it's 3. Could be only 2, but whatever we have scheduled going forward. Our plan is to look at some kind of specific issues with this framework of what makes a person, with these kind of building blocks in mind. We'll talk. We won't. Let's not pin down what's next because I think it might be worthwhile for us to talk.
Yeah, we should talk. I'll be here next week.
Yeah, we'll think about what the next thing is. And I would say by way of closing, so it's not necessary for us, for our purposes here to solve, the question of human nature, whether we're more good or more bad or anything like that. I think it is, or at least I'll speak for myself. It has been for me necessary to come to some sort of livable compromise when it comes to this, which I'll tell you for me what my compromise is. So I sort of suspect, like I was saying, I think in response to Mike earlier, that some of our understanding of impulse as bad, or labeling of it as bad, comes as a necessary result of understanding mitzvot as good. So for me, if that's the case, because I want the latter to be true, but not the former. Like I want mitzvot to be good, but I don't necessarily want base instincts like sexual drive, that kind of stuff, to be labeled evil as bad, because I've seen the negative consequences from that kind of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
So this is me trying to have it both ways. I no longer have a sense of aveira, a sense of transgression or sin, if you want to call it, with regard to some, but not necessarily all of the mitzvot. And those would be the mitzvot that are bein adam l'makom. I don't necessarily have a sense of transgression against God. If that makes sense anymore. I think you could absolutely transgress against people, and all the mitzvot that come to govern our relationship with other people. You can definitely sin against other people. But when it comes to sin against God, and this is partially informed by my study of tshuva and how much God, according to rabbinic sources, how much God wants tshuva and how easy it is, at least in theory, when tshuva is done properly. God takes you back right away, as it were, right? That there's no way to sin when doing ritual commandments. There's no way to light Shabbat candles wrong or evilly. There's no way to light candles wickedly, right? There's no way to keep kosher fail to do it in such a way that you are bad.
You don't think that violating kashrut privately violating kashrut disrupts the karma of the universe? In other words, the
You've
energy.
introduced
If
a term
you-
for the Jewish.
So here's a natural law and a physical law and a psychic law. If you eat wildlife in markets
Sure.
without regulation, you're violating a law of the universe, and you might get sick
Sure.
and spread horrible diseases
So,
from killing.
I would
from
say
eating
that.
leopards and lions and chimps, which is the bushmeat kind of stuff.
But what if
Yeah.
you use the wrong fork?
Right.
Well, sure. I don't say
use the wrong fork
ethical,
and kashrut.
ethical eating.
Is God going to be angry and like unforgiving?
Ethical eating and halachic kashrut are not necessarily co-identical. I mean, I think that should be obvious. I would hope.
But yeah, if you mix milk and meat
Yeah.
utensils, is there some karmic or cosmic,
So I guess I'll speak for myself. I would say no.
No,
I
okay,
would
and the
say no.
Kabbalists would say yes.
I think they would.
Kabbalah, they would say it has
But-
Kabbalistic, impact.
Yeah, but if God is ineffable and we can't presume to know God's mind or intention, isn't the yoke on you? Ultimately?
And I think that's sort of how I have it both ways. Is it makes allowance for the yoke on me to be conscious of my sins against others, and let mitzvot still be positive without necessarily understanding every sort of, I guess, anti-mitzvah. Like anytime one might give in to an impulse at the expense of doing a mitzvah, without necessarily understanding every one of those as bad. If that makes sense.
This leads to Leibowitz, to me. Leibowitz not so interested in God. He's interested in mitzvot as
I'm curious what he
regulatory.
would say about me.
Yeah, he would
Maybe
say,
not.
I think Leibowitz would say that this yoke of Torah helps regulate society, creates a holy society.
Right.
Right.
And it would not really have to talk too much about God. He elevates
Yeah.
halakha to creating a conscious, holy society.
And he would understand all of the mitzvot in Ben Adam Makom or Ben Adam Makom,
Right.
interpersonal or
That's
between you and God is all part of that same project.
Right.
Where I make a bit of a distinction.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't heard anybody phrase it that way. But that's
Well,
interesting. Very interesting.
There you go. That's not an original idea on my part. I drew some inspiration to that from our Green, Rabbi Art Green.
Well,
That's not necessarily exactly what he thinks.
the other way, the Middle
But
Ages,
that's what I took from
like Art Green, yeah. In the Middle Ages, they thought that private sins had demonic consequences. If you masturbate, they were obsessed with masturbation for like 500 years.
They should have read full of
Obsessed
broth.
with it.
And they could have
Because they felt it had
Checked out.
karmic, horrible consequences in terms of creating demons.
Oh.
And then they got obsessed with the Lilith myth. And so anything that you did privately sexually that was a violation of what the rabbis constructed as halakha was an egregious cosmic sin.
Oh yeah.
And you got all kinds of treatises on masturbation. You wouldn't believe
Oh yeah.
how much these medievals obsessed about masturbation, and which is a perfectly natural thing okay, perfectly natural, right?
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm not going to raise my right hand.
There we go.
But what
So
I'm going to tell you is that what they constructed, many natural sexual things, they constructed as evil or demonic.
Right.
Christians
Power.
too.
Of
It
course.
gives them power.
To
Yeah.
give them power over people's
Right.
behavior.
Right.
You'll then demons will come and the succubus and the
The
incubus.
control.
So-
It's control issues.
So great example is clearly a non-interpersonal, issue when it comes to masturbation.
Right,
That's at most in between a person and God.
right. Let
In which case, I have no sense of transgression.
the
there.
Lord strike your right hand.
There's no sense of I have no sense of transgression.
Unless you're left-handed.
Or left,
there.
let God do it, right?
So a great example, and I would say we should wrap up here, but you don't have to solve it in absolute terms. But I would say it might be worthwhile to figure out, in personal terms for you, how to understand your nature versus your impulse.
Very good.
And figure out how you're going to navigate that balance.
Right,
That's worthwhile and not something I can do for you.
right.
You're welcome to copy me, but you
I
have to
like
have
the Chafetz Chaim is worth considering. I've thought about him for many
Sure.
years. Regulation of speech.
Great.
Speaking about others.
Judaism has plenty to
Positively,
say.
negatively,
about how
but
to
even
do that.
positively. And he's very strict. His book sold millions of copies. He's very popular in the Orthodox world. That's the Netzor L'Shon Chamera. You shall not speak ill of others. Lashon Hara. It's an entire
Copy
book
on my shelf.
based on other books, but he wrote that in the 19th century, maybe. Yeah,
Sounds right.
early 20th, I don't know, but that book is all about speech. Now, if you read that book, you may disagree with some of his points, but the major point is important. Time you speak negatively about somebody, you bring about there's negative energies, right?
Right.
And it leads to community issues, and people always speak about other people, right? It's kind of natural to speak about other people. So how do those laws apply? And Jews differ on this, on Lashon Hara, and speaking about other people. But that would mean, I think, that we need to pay attention to the mitzvahs around speech.
Oh, yeah.
It's cost me. It's cost all of us at some level,
Absolutely.
right?
And I would maintain that regulating speech is as hard as regulating some of the other drives that we consider to be.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Very
I
hard.
agree.
Yeah.
Well,
It's very
Judaism has
tough. Yes.
plenty of resources to help you with that
If you
and those pursuits.
the 1 second rule of contemplating what you were about to say,
Yeah.
which the Buddhists are very good at teaching us. Take 1 second, maybe 2, before you speak, right? And weigh your words. And so that's related to Yetzer Hara too, or Yetzer is impulsive speech.
Okay.
Good. The monk.
Thanks, friends.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for your
Yeah.
contributions. That was a really good, about a good give and take on that one. I appreciate it. We'll see you again in a week.
Have a natural week. Have a mitzvah week.